Good afternoon, Rotarians and guests. My name is Kevin Sheehan, and as President of the Rotary Club of Melbourne, I welcome you to our 35th meeting of the Rotary year, our 4,835th meeting, and our third online meeting in our 99-year history. Last week, we had as guest speaker our own member, Hugh Bucknell, who delivered a superb address that gave us great depth from his experience with the SARS outbreak, and he wanted us to certainly focus on not wasting this crisis. Please do have a look at his, have a listen to his presentation, which is now on our website, as he left us with many good thought starters as how we would proceed in this time. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Derek Farrell, Principal Lecturer in Psychology at the University of Worcester, United Kingdom, an EMDR Therapy Europe accredited trainer and consultant. The presentation you're about to watch was delivered to an audience of Rotarians on the 24th of February, as organised by our own Norman Terreloid Bay, Cynthia Edgell, and Pam Brown, and organised also by the Rotary Action Group for Family Safety, supported by Rotary Melbourne. The Rotary Action Group had invited Dr. Farrell to conduct a weekend of training for therapists from the bushfire areas, the reason for his visit. We pick up the presentation as our Vice President, Cynthia Edgell, introduces our guest speaker.
It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Derek Farrell. Derek is a Principal Lecturer in Psychology at the University of Worcester, an EMDR Therapy Europe accredited trainer and consultant, a chartered psychologist, and an accredited psychotherapist. His PhD in psychology was researching survivors' experience of sexual abuse perpetrated by the clergy. Among many other roles, Derek is president of Trauma Aid Europe and is involved in a number of humanitarian capacity building programs in, listen to this, Pakistan, Turkey, India, Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, Lebanon, Poland, Palestine, and Iraq, most recently with those poor Yazidi women. This is Derek's fourth visit to Melbourne, I've discovered, to train in EMDR therapy, all pro bono. Last June, he came to train those dealing with victims of institutional abuse. This weekend was to train approximately 70 EMDR therapists to work in communities suffering from the trauma of bushfires. I attended on Saturday and was proud to see the Rotary banner affirming our support. EMDR, which I expect you all know, stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which seems to me an almost magical therapy in its economy of time, efficiency, and lasting effectiveness. So I was delighted to hear Derek say, "It never ceases to amaze me." Derek, you also commented that you don't get invited to many dinner parties because you talk about trauma all the time. Please do.
This is very true. I don't get invited to dinner parties at all, so this is very, very nice, really. So thank you very, very much for the invitation. I'd like to just sort of pick up on something that that Greg said about mental health, and you talked about the fact that actually, you instill this message of hope about the fact that actually there's large swathes of mental health that are treatable. And one of the things that I've certainly experienced, you know, when as a young trauma psychologist, I used to have quite dark hair. But then you go around the world, and actually what you hear is some terrible, terrible things that human beings do to other human beings, you know, in that sense. And I've, as a trauma psychologist, you often end up sort of working with populations that you don't expect to work with. And we meet clients that completely and utterly change our lives. And about 30 years ago, I met a young woman who had been really quite horrifically assaulted by an Anglican priest. And as a young therapist, I'd never heard of this before. And I was actually really quite relieved when I heard her story, because I thought, well, at least thank goodness it's not a Roman Catholic priest. And so that what made me then sort of look at this in a lot more detail and start to really research it. And actually, there was not much in the literature in the early 90s about this as a phenomenon, in that sense. And so that's why I started to sort of to work with it. And one of the things that really shocked me the most when I was looking into the issue was doing a historical sort of back trajectory at the point of which point in history did the Roman Catholic Church first starting to legislate for its sexual abuse by clerics. And was really horrified the fact that actually the first time that they did this was back in the 4th century. So it's something about the fact that how institutions have been able to propel sort of very, very sort of strong levels of trauma for many, many, in many, many ways, and yet on the other hand be capable of doing such good and impact on community building. So I don't think I ever set out to be a trauma therapist. But constantly along the way, you always meet clients that change your directory in lots of different ways. And I, as a young therapist, you're training lots of different approaches, but you're always thinking about, is there a way that's more effective? Is there a way that's more efficient? And I probably trained in about 8 or 9 different evidence-based trauma treatments, and then came across an American psychological treatment known as EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which has to be probably the worst title of a therapy that you could ever come up with. It's really strange, in terms of the fact that you're getting people to really work on their trauma memories, activating their trauma memories, and then you stimulate them. You stimulate them in a way very similar to what happens when we sleep. We go through a period of sleep known as slow wave sleep, which is very vital for information processing. And why this is important is because, if I asked many of you about what did you have for dinner a week last Tuesday, most of you probably couldn't tell me. Often my OCD clients can tell me exactly what they had for dinner, but most people can't, because our brains are processing information all of the time. It decides what it needs and it gets rid of stuff that it doesn't need. But trauma has an impact on memory, which is really very, very important, because when we experience a traumatic event that's distressing, that's overwhelming, sometimes the brain struggles to digest it. And one of the oldest experiences I had was a woman who was 88 years of age. She had spent her entire adult life in a psychiatric hospital. And she knew she was dying, but she wanted to disclose something before she died. And she described a memory that was 82 years old. 82 years old. And this was a memory that she had never disclosed to anybody. And this was a sexual assault. But that memory had not altered. It still had all of its vivid images. It still had strong belief systems, the fact that she must have been responsible for this, even though she was a child. And even though she recalled it, she recounted the physical level of disturbance that goes with that. And this is why the brain is fascinating in terms of the fact that when we have these memories, what we know is that for some people, those memories don't disappear, they don't change. And that there is a need to then look at, well, what are the interventions that we can use to try and alleviate these? And this is where EMDR sort of comes in. It's a way of activating a memory, stimulating it, because the brain is built to move things. The brain is built to process information. So this is why, I'm very fortunate to have travelled to all of the countries that you very kindly mentioned, and I've only recently started to collect air miles, which was not, I should have done that sort of 25 years ago. But the point is the fact that trauma is ubiquitous. And coming back to what Greg said about the fact that actually to make such an inroad into sort of, in terms of the death of babies is incredible. It is incredible. It's, when you look at the huge impact Rotary's had on polio. But then you look at trauma, and what we have to acknowledge is the fact that trauma populations are going in the opposite direction, because they're not getting smaller. It's actually the prevalence of trauma is increasing. You're probably aware of something that happened in the UK literature, which is that in 2019, more children were abused in the United Kingdom than at any point since records began. So there's something about the fact that actually we're modernizing as a society, but actually the prevalence of trauma is actually is going up. It's not going down. The second thing that you're probably aware of is the fact that we've got more traumatized populations on the move now than at any point since the Second World War. And it's fair to say the fact that actually Europe is not dealing with this in the level in which it should. So what we've got is huge numbers of trauma populations. What we also have is we have a very good knowledge and awareness of what works and what doesn't work. But the problem we have is trying to get the traumatized population with the right treatment. And that also has implications for resources. And I want to come back onto this point a little bit later on. The third aspect that I want to look at is the fact that actually the raison d'etre for being here was to really look at the horrific trauma experiences of the bushfires. And as you know, you don't need anything from me to tell you about how horrific these are, how devastating these are. But it's very easy to make a mistake. It's very easy to make a mistake. And the mistake is to actually, when you look at the bushfires as a trauma, you only see it as one trauma. But actually what we see with trauma, in whichever difficult spot we go to in the world, is the fact that it may be a particular traumatic episode that gets you into that country, but actually when you lift the rock up, you actually see a whole morass of all of the other traumas that are going on, within that environment. And I learned this the hard way, arriving in one of my first sort of disaster zones, being Pakistan, many, many years ago after the earthquake. And this was a devastating earthquake. I'd never been into an earthquake zone before. And the level of destruction that human nature, issued in that event was very, very significant. There was a very, very high death toll, well into the 80,000s of people that died. And we were trying to train local mental health workers in working with trauma. But what fascinated me about when I was doing some clinical work with clients, I expected them to want to talk about their earthquake traumas. But actually they didn't. They didn't. They wanted to talk about, the women wanted to talk about gender-based violence. The men wanted to talk about their fear and anxiety about what happens when their children goes to school because they're terrified the fact that their children are going to be killed by a suicide bomber. And so this is something that we see all of the time. And it's a phenomenon that actually we see here, we see in lots and lots of different communities. So when we're talking about trauma, we're not just talking about PTSD. Okay, PTSD is a very, very important clinical diagnosis, but there are lots of people who are traumatized that don't meet the criteria for complex PTSD. The second thing is the fact that we have client groups that have not just experienced one trauma. They've experienced lots of traumas, sometimes a lifetime of trauma. And again, the international community has very good literature now to support the fact that actually, if you have children who are traumatized and they don't get treatment, not only does that impact on their adult levels of functioning, but it makes them sick. It makes them ill. And actually the more children are exposed to adverse childhood experiences, the more of an impact it can have on their life expectancy. It actually shortens their life. So this is why, coming back to Norman's opening speech about sort of protecting the land and children becomes so absolutely pivotal. So looking at things through the lens of trauma is the fact that we see it in lots and lots of different ways. It's about loss, not just about relationships, but also the loss of objects. Lots of objects that often have many treasured sort of possessions. It can be bereavement. It can generate lots of feelings of shame, lots of problems with identity. But it can also have impacts not just on the individual, but on the wider community. And this is something I want to come back to a bit later on in terms of why we have to look at interventions that are not just about how we help people on a one-to-one basis. We also have to look at interventions that very much look at how do you heal communities, how do you facilitate reconciliation and recovery in traumatized communities. Probably the person who's written probably the best about this is Miller's work in 2012, which talks about any intervention that we do in any post-disaster scenario, like the bushfires. That intervention needs to be provided by professionals and non-professional people. And there's a very good reason for this. So if we go back to the global burden of psychological trauma, current estimates is that there are approximately 500 million people that would meet a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, when we're in a world population of about 7.5 billion, then 500 million is a huge amount of people. The other thing that we have to acknowledge in regard to that is that there are absolutely not a sufficient number of mental health professionals in order to meet that need. Now, one of the examples where we see this a lot is in Iraq. At the moment, our current estimates are that around about 65 to 70% of the population of Iraq are highly traumatized. They only have one clinical psychology training in the whole of Iraq, and it trains about 6 psychologists a year. Okay, so if we're looking for a solution that involves using mental health professionals like psychiatrists and psychologists, we're never going to meet that need. So this is why we have to look at creative ways of doing this. And so this is what the essence of this point is the fact that we can't just find a professional solution to this. We also have to look at non-professionals. The other thing that links with this is the fact that, what we know is that, if you're going into a starving community, you don't go in with a whole load of fish. What you do is that you go in and you teach that community how to fish and be self-sufficient itself. And trauma is exactly the same. Is that you want to use the resources that are there within that community, and you want to empower them, in that sense. The other aspect that's actually really critical of this is the fact that actually we can't get away from the fact that lots of traumatized people don't want to see people like me. Because actually, we represent fear, we represent anxiety, even though our intentions may be very, very honorable. But actually the people who they trust the most are often the people within their own community. But the people in their community may not be sufficiently trained in order to work with this really in that sense. So this is why in any of the interventions that we do, and in all of the countries that we've talked about, we don't just go in, we do a training and then we leave, because it always has to be based on the principle of sustainability. And the only way you get sustainability is actually from building it from within the community, from building it within the country, and then giving them the right amount of help and support in order to enable them to do this. So this is why any intervention that we do always has to be about cultural responsiveness. We are cosmopolitan societies. We have lots of different belief systems. We have lots of different value systems. And any trauma intervention has to acknowledge and has to sort of respect this. The second is the fact that the power has to come from within. You know, it's not just about sort of, making them reliant on sort of external resources. But the third thing is the fact that actually, you know this, but human beings are really quite remarkable. They're really quite resilient. And if you look at, 100 people that are involved in a road traffic collision, how many of them go on to develop PTSD? Well, it would be around about 6 or 7. And so you then have to ask yourself, well, that's very disturbing for the 6 or 7, and we need to look at what's the most effective treatments for those, but what happened to the other 94? What did they have in their own armory in order to be able to address and deal with this? And so any trauma intervention is not just about going in and focusing on negatives. It's always about going in and actually looking at it in a more balanced way and really focusing on people's sort of strength and resilience really in that sense. The fourth principle is the fact that the best environment where children learn how to interact is within the family. Family is a real life group therapy intervention, in that sense. But it's a place where we learn all of those social norms, all of those social rules. So any trauma intervention needs to embrace those, those exact sort of same principles really in that sense. So this is why the point that we acknowledge is the fact that the bushfires have been devastating. They have. But you don't need me as an Englishman to come in and say, but you're going to have other bushfires. You've had lots of devastating ones in the past, and the likelihood is that you're going to have lots of devastating ones in the future. But our responsibility is to then look at, well, what can we do? What can we learn? What can we develop in order to try and prevent the alleviation of suffering sort of later on down the line, really. So this is why we get to this position. When disasters occur, it's like lifting up a stone. The whole morass of existing trauma phenomenon is there, and it's now on display. And we know this because one of the other trauma aspects that's also going on is around gender-based violence. This is also something that is increasing, and not decreasing in that sense. And so looking at the World Bank's data from last year, 35% of women worldwide have experienced either physical and or sexual intimate partner violence. So this is why we start to get an understanding about why the global burden of trauma is so immense. A nice metaphor for explaining about trauma is this notion about these 4 violences, where we often talk about these direct violences. Direct violences are really traumas that are perpetrated by other human beings. And then you have these natural violences where the bushfires will very much sort of fit into that. But actually the 2 other types of violence that we don't talk about are about culture and about structure. Forgive me for being manipulative, but if I give you a British example, that we've just lived through 15 years of economic austerity, where we've seen a massive increase in poverty, effectively. But in that same period, we've also created more billionaires than at any point in our history. And so we start to see the fact that these great sort of disparities between those that have and those that don't, these also create trauma populations. They also create vulnerable populations, really, in that sense. Now, What's also interesting when we then look at this in relation to the bushfires is when we look at it in regard to their recovery. Because what the data shows from lots of meta-analyses is the fact that when a trauma is non-intentional, like a natural disaster, actually 50% of the people improve themselves. And so you see this massive reduction in terms of their trauma symptoms. So this is what the blue line is here. But when a trauma is actually perpetrated by another human being, what you see is the exact opposite. Is the fact that actually the prevalence of trauma sort of goes up. Now the bushfires actually create, on one level, sort of quite an intriguing problem really, because the bushfires are both non-intentional but also intentional, and so we would expect the fact that actually the trajectory for this will be an amalgamation of the two. And what both of these bits of data show is the fact that actually it's much better to do something than to do nothing. To do nothing probably would be the most risky, would be the most sort of negligent really in that sense. So when we talk about interventions, this is what's called the intervention period that's often used by the World Health Organization. And it talks about these, these four areas around specialist services, focused non-specialist support, community support, and basic services and security here. But when we're talking about therapists and we're talking about psychologists and psychiatrists, we're only talking about this part of the pyramid. And the problem with that comes back to what we said before, is the fact that demand outstrips supply. Demand outstrips supply. So we have to look for other solutions in terms of how we're going to deal with this really. So any trauma treatment that's been supported by the World Health Organization or supported by the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies or supported by lots of national governance bodies, that trauma interventions actually break down into these four categories. You have psychoeducation, you have trauma stabilization, you have trauma confrontation, which is really the point where you're directly sort of processing, trauma memories. And then you get these concepts here around reinvention, resilience, post-traumatic growth. Because what we also know about trauma is that trauma changes people. And one of the expectations people have is they want their lives to go back to the way things were before, but often this is just not possible because the world is a fundamentally sort of different place, really. I won't go too much into the details, but if you think about some of the experiences that you may have, you wake up tomorrow morning, you have a pain in your stomach and you've never had this pain before. And if you think about what's the process that you then go through? You're then trying to think, well, have I eaten something? Have I drunk something? If it may be, an illness or something. But probably what you will do these days is that you'll pick your phone up, or you'll pick your iPad up, or you'll switch your computer on, and you'll go onto Google, and you'll start to type in your symptoms. And the reason why you're doing this is because you're searching for meaning. You're searching for an explanation in order to account for why you're experiencing some of the things that you are. And so this is the part that psychoeducation plays, is the fact that actually lots of traumatized people just need information. They need information to explain why they're having flashbacks. They need information to explain why they're having nightmares, or why they're irritable, or why they're drinking too much, or why they may be smoking too much. These are just examples, by the way. I'm not self-disclosing, in that sense. Just in case you're worrying about that. So, but it works on the principle, the fact that actually people just want to know why they are experiencing what they are, but they then also need something else, because information is one thing, but they then need to know what the heck can I do about it, in that sense. So how can I stop the flashbacks? How can I stop, drinking too much? How can I stop being sort of irritable, really, in that sense? Because for some people, you just need to empower them. You just need to give them the resources. But the thing about these resources is that in many ways you don't need to be a seasoned clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist to do this. It's the fact that actually, we're talking about in principle what we call trauma-informed care or trauma-informed interventions. But actually where we should be is having trauma-informed conversation. It's about increasing the discourse as to why trauma is important. You gave the example before about mental health in the workplace. There was a very, very interesting study published here in Australia 3 years ago that actually looked at the prevalence of bullying within the consultant surgery community. So consultant surgeons talking about their experiences of bullying. And what was so shocking about the numbers that they were talking about is that 6% of those consultant surgeons had seriously contemplating ending their own life because of what was going on in the workplace. This is trauma. This is trauma. So coming back to your point before, Greg, these are some of the links. These are some of the important sort of crossovers as to why trauma is a fundamental sort of mental health issue, really, in that sense. So this is why we come back to the point, the fact that actually we're not going to solve this by professionals alone, that we have to use non-mental health professionals. It's about empowering paraprofessionals. And again, coming back to the point that we mentioned earlier about the importance of community building. Now, within the EMDR literature, there are 2 group treatment interventions that are very effective. There's very interesting research data supporting their efficacy, but there's also something about the way in which they're being implemented in a way, as Miller talked about, in a culturally sensitive way. So these are interventions we've done in Pakistan, in Iraq, in Lebanon, Palestine, et cetera, et cetera. So it involves these type of groups, so it's what's called an intergroup group treatment and a group traumatic episode. And so basically it's a little bit like this. It's probably a very bizarre diagram, but part of the treatment effect is the fact that you're getting traumatized groups of people together in the same room. And that in itself is helpful, because often the place that you need to identify is a place that's already in the community where people feel safe, whether it's a church, whether it's a community, a centre, whether it's a school, in that sense. And part of that first part of the process is about having an open conversation about trauma, talking about what's happened, trying to normalise their traumatic experiences. Now, what we also know as an educationalist is that 2/3 of people are visual learners. They need to see things. They just don't want to be told about it, really. So in certain parts of trauma treatment, what we do is we use this. We actually get people to almost like externally visualize their trauma experiences. And so this is what you'll see here. Although these are very, very abstract, but you're getting the person to think about a particular trauma memory, and you want them to draw it, or you want them to, say a word about it, or a sentence about it. Now, as a trauma psychologist, what we're doing there is we're activating the memory. We're bringing the memory more into the mind. And then you'll see here these bits, and you're probably asking, well, why are there 4 butterflies, in this process? And it's a technique that we teach children as a means of self-care. We get them to, because most children seem to like butterflies, and so we get them to, create a butterfly, in this sense, and then as you bring it onto yourself, you start doing what we call is a form of bilateral stimulation. Now, I won't go into the neurobiology about this, but why, on one level you might think, well, that looks bonkers, but actually neurobiologically this makes an awful lot of sense. So you're getting people to activate a very, very difficult memory, and actually what you're getting the brain to do is 2 things at the same time. The brain is always wanting to move bits of information on all of the time. So So all we're doing is actually getting the person to step into the memory and then come back out of it again. Step into the memory and step back out of it. Now, there's two advantages of this protocol. One is the fact that for some people, there is a genuine symptom reduction. We have lots of data now that supports the fact that this is a treatment effect if it's repeated. If it's repeated within that community between 6 and 8 times. The second thing is that we notice is that for some people, their level of disturbance doesn't go down, their level of disturbance stays the same, or it goes up. But this is helpful because it means that we can use this trauma treatment with risk assessment. We can use it as a form of triage because if I'm just one therapist, I can't do individual work with everybody that's in this room. But if we do certain types of trauma intervention and we find that for 50% of the people they get symptom reduction, but there's 10% where it goes up, it means that we can then target those 10% in a more creative way. So it's a more effective way of working traumatologically with the community, but it also helps us to identify those people that then may need more specialist help. And so the advantage of these types of protocols is the fact that with the right support and the right training, we can train non-mental health people to do this. We can train people from within vulnerable communities to, to do this, providing they've got the right help, the right support, and the right sort of clinical supervision. So this is from a case in Pakistan. It was a young boy who had been involved in a road traffic accident. And so you'll see that this is his first drawing. This was his second drawing here. And so you see the level of disturbance goes up. The third time we dropped into it, you'll see the level of disturbance came down. And then the fourth time, he was able to then reconnect with a part of the memory that was a lot more positive. Now, we were very lucky in this case that this was just in one session, but you see the essence of the progress in terms of how this will fit really. Now, the other aspect of the community is the fact that we like to think that all of our communities are healthy, are functional, are caring, are compassionate. And the simple reality is that not all of them are. Sometimes we go into lots of environments where some communities do not want anything to do with another part of their community, in that sense. And so we have to be very, very, very sort of strategic and very, very clear about what we can and what we can't do in that sense. But one of the other reasons why this is important with regards to reconstruction is really about emphasizing why reconciliation plays a very important part in healing. Now, forgive me, because you probably know this story, but I think it sort of links this very, very well. But in Northern Ireland, that they've experienced 35 years of conflict between the Catholic and the Protestant community. And this was known as a cold conflict because actually they didn't want to talk to one another. So Bill Clinton at the time invited, Senator George Mitchell to come as a peace envoy. And so what he did is he invited the politicians to Stormont, the main public building in Northern Ireland, and he gave each of the political parties a room. And his job he wanted to try and stoke the fire in that sense. And so he went into the rooms and he said, well, this is what Sinn Féin are saying about you. This is what sort of the Ulster Unions are saying about you. And so to get them animated. What he also noticed is the fact that 98% of the politicians in Northern Ireland at the time were men. But he didn't just invite the male politicians. He also invited their wives. And he invited the wives to Stormont, but he invited them specifically for dinner. And he invited them into the kitchen and said, look, we're all going to have dinner together. Oh, and by the way, you're going to cook it yourselves. And so what did they do? They developed a strategy. They started to talk to one another. they started to share about their real life experiences. So Mrs. Trimble went home and said, you know, I was talking to Mrs. Adams today. Gosh, she's really lovely. You know, they're worried about which university their son's going to go to as well. And isn't the cost of car insurance in Northern Ireland, you know, horrendous for our young people? So they shared a narrative. They shared a narrative. And this was a pivotal breakthrough as to why these political parties sort of come together. Now, the reason why this is important is because we know that part of lifting the rock up of the trauma is the fact that part of the reconstruction is that these conflicts get even more exacerbated. They get even more sort of entrenched. So this is why any intervention has to ultimately sort of consider these really in that sense. Now, I learned a very interesting fact here only on this gig actually, and that is the fact that actually you're about 5,000 clinical psychologists short in this country. And you only have funding to train 1,000 clinical psychologists a year. But the other interesting bit is the fact that within the next 5 years, 50% of those psychologists are going to retire. And so you're going to run out of psychologists. And that's, I'm only just looking at psychologists, you know, in that sense. And so, you know, I told you about the Iraq situation. So just to sum up, because I don't want to send you to sleep, but the reality is the fact that the global burden of trauma is going up. It's not going down. It's an increasing concern. What we need is appropriately trained clinicians. But if we just relied on professionals, demand will outstrip supply. We have to look at a more creative way of looking at this. Trauma-focused non-mental health workers who are appropriately trained, who are appropriately supported, who are clinically supervised, they can play a major part in this. But so do community interventions. This is why we can't just look at it from an individual treatment. We have to look at some of these group treatments as well, really. Because the final point is, if we seek a professionals-only solution, we will fail. And the reality is that if we want to go fast, we can go alone. But actually, if we want to go strong, we go together. And in order to do that, we need to think about paraprofessionals, and we also need to think about the importance of group interventions. Guys, thank you very much for your time. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you.
As we have all just heard, it is vital to recognise that mental health is a major ongoing concern from the recent bushfires in Victoria. Indeed, there are many takeouts for us. The Rotary Action Group for Family Safety, with the support of Rotary Melbourne, have provided this valuable opportunity for members of our district to meet with Dr. Farrell, to learn about international programs designed to build the capacity for communities to heal after major disasters. Rotary Melbourne is pleased to share Dr. Farrell's address to a wider audience in support of the good work that our district's Bushfire Response Committee is undertaking, and particularly in support of our President-elect, Marion McLeod, who is a participant on that response committee. Any questions that you might have as an outcome of Dr. Farrell's address or any other matter can be emailed to our Rotary office or myself. Thank you for participating today, and you'll receive advice shortly as to our meeting next week. In the meantime, stay safe and spread kindness everywhere. Good afternoon.